Rain wasn't falling that night in Los Angeles, but the air inside the restaurant felt heavier than any storm. String lights hung across the exposed brick walls Renae had chosen herself. The long oak counter she'd sanded down with her own hands gleamed under the track lighting. Every surface in this room had her fingerprints on it. Tonight, it belonged to someone else's announcement. More than 80 people stood shoulder to shoulder holding champagne flutes. Local real estate agents, a city council member, 2 reporters from a business journal, and Terrence Coleman, standing at the center of it all in a charcoal suit that fit him better than anything he'd owned when Renae met him. He tapped his glass with a fork. The room quieted. Renae stood near the kitchen pass, still in her apron, having just plated the last tray of short rib sliders for the caterers to circulate. She hadn't planned to be part of the speech. She hadn't been asked to be. 12 years ago I had nothing, Terrence began, his voice smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned exactly how to fill a room. A car that didn't start half the time, a real estate license I couldn't afford the exam fee for, and a vision nobody believed in. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Tonight we're announcing Coleman Realty Group's new flagship headquarters, right here, in this space. Applause. Renae's hands stayed still on the counter. And I want to be transparent with all of you, because transparency is what we build on, Terrence continued. This chapter of my life is closing in more ways than one. Renae and I are separating. She was part of where I started, but where I'm going now requires a different kind of partner. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone realizes they just watched something they weren't supposed to. Simone, standing beside him in a fitted emerald dress, leaned into the silence instead of away from it. Some people just aren't built for where we're going, she said, just loud enough to carry. A few people chuckled, uncertain. The kind of laugh people give when they don't know if it's safe to laugh. Renae didn't move. She didn't drop a tray. She didn't raise her voice. She untied her apron slowly, folded it, and set it on the counter she'd built with money she earned, standing over hot stoves for 12 years. In the back corner of the room near the door, an older Korean man in a plain gray cardigan set down his coffee cup without finishing it. His name was Mr. Yoon. He had run the small grocery next door to this block for over 20 years. He looked at Renae for a long moment. Then he looked at Terrence. Then he quietly walked out into the parking lot, pulled out his phone, and made a call. "It's time," he said. Nobody in that room heard him. Nobody yet understood what those 2 words meant. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to know which city and country you're joining us from tonight. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, betrayal, and the kind of justice that takes its time but never forgets, subscribe to Mind Tales and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. To understand what happened in that restaurant, you have to go back 12 years, to a folding table at a Saturday farmer's market in Inglewood, where a 24-year-old woman named Renae Whitfield sold plates of her grandmother's smothered chicken and candied yams out of 2 coolers she carried in the back of a borrowed hatchback. She had graduated culinary school 18 months earlier, with more debt than direction, and a recipe box that had belonged to her grandmother, Odessa, a woman who had run a small diner on this same block back when black-owned businesses lined this street, before the city rezoned half of it out from under them in the 80s. That rezoning had wiped out nearly a dozen family businesses along a 6-block stretch within 18 months, replacing them with strip malls and franchise signage that never once acknowledged what had stood there before. Odessa had watched almost every neighbor she'd known for decades sell under pressure, take a fraction of what the land was worth, and start over somewhere, with less history and less meaning. She never told most people, including her own daughter, exactly how she had managed to hold on to anything at all, only that she had made a friend at the right time and kept her word to him. Renae didn't have investors. She didn't have a storefront. She had a folding table, a portable burner, and a stubbornness that people mistook for shyness, because she rarely raised her voice. Terrence showed up at that market selling nothing, just working the crowd, handing out business cards for a real estate license he hadn't finished paying for. He was magnetic in the way ambitious broke people often are, all vision and no capital, talking about property values and neighborhood turnarounds like he could already see the future everyone else was too slow to notice. He bought a plate from her table the first day they met, then came back the next Saturday and the one after that, until it became clear the food wasn't the only reason he kept returning. Renae's mother had died 8 months before Renae met Terrence, after 2 decades of working double shifts as a home health aide to keep the lights on and Renae in culinary school. The life insurance payout came to $41,000, money her mother had built slowly, sacrifice by sacrifice, never once spending it on herself, even when her knees gave out, and she kept working anyway. When Terrence needed capital to finish his licensing and put down earnest money on his first flip, Renae didn't hesitate. She handed him an envelope with that money inside it and told him it was an investment in both of them. He held her hands that day and told her he would never forget what she'd done, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure it meant something. For a while, he did. He brought her coffee on cold mornings before her market shifts. He helped her lift the coolers into the car without being asked. He introduced her to people as his fiancée, with a kind of pride that made her believe every risk she'd taken on him had been the right one. 2 years into his career, a deal fell through at the last moment, and Terrence came up short on earnest money for a property he was certain would make his name in the business. Renae didn't have cash sitting anywhere else to give him. What she had was her grandmother's wedding ring, a thin gold band her grandfather had bought with his very first paycheck after coming home from the war, saved for months before he could afford it. The only piece of real jewelry her grandmother ever owned, and the one thing Renae had kept when she cleared out the family house. She sat with that ring in her palm for a long time before she took it to a pawn shop on Crenshaw. She never told Terrence what it was or where it came from. She only told him she'd found a way to cover the shortfall, and he thanked her, kissed her forehead, and never once asked what she'd given up to do it. That deal closed. It became the first real success of his career, the one he'd tell people about at networking events for years afterward, always leaving out the part where a folding table caterer had quietly made it possible. Those were the years Renae would later describe as the good years, the ones where love still felt like building something together, instead of watching something slip away. Terrence would swing by her market stall, just to carry the heavy pans to her car. She would wait outside his broker's office in the evening, with dinner in a foil container, because she knew he skipped lunch when he was closing a deal. They shared one bed, one budget, one dream, and neither of them thought to ask whose name the dream was actually being built in. On Sunday mornings, before the market opened, Terrence would sit at the small kitchen table in their apartment and read property listings out loud, while Renae tested new recipes on the stove, calling out prices and square footage, like other couples might talk about vacations they were planning together. She remembers one Sunday specifically, a listing for a modest commercial space not far from where her grandmother's old diner used to stand. Terrence joking that one day he'd buy the whole block back for her, piece by piece, the way it should have stayed in the first place. She had laughed, and told him she'd hold him to that, not knowing that the block had, in a sense, never actually left her family at all. It was a small moment, easily forgotten in the years that followed, but Renae would think about it often. Later, after everything changed, wondering when exactly the man who said those words had stopped meaning them, or if he ever had at all. It was around this time that Renae first noticed Mr. Yoon paying closer attention to her than a grocer usually would to a customer. He ran the small corner store next to where her grandmother's old diner used to stand, and when Renae started scraping together the money to rent her first real kitchen space nearby, he began extending her credit on ingredients during the lean weeks, without ever being asked, waving off her attempts to pay him back on time with a simple, pay me when the kitchen is full. She never understood why an old man she barely knew would extend that kind of trust to a stranger, and when she asked him once, directly, why he was so generous, he only said, "Your grandmother fed a lot of people who couldn't pay her back either." I remember. She let it go at the time. She had too much else to think about. The business grew slowly and then not so slowly. Terrence's name started appearing in local real estate write-ups. He stopped taking meetings in coffee shops and started taking them in downtown high-rises. He bought his first tailored suit, then his second, then stopped wearing the jacket Renae had given him for his first birthday together because it didn't fit the image anymore. The changes were small enough at first that Renae told herself she was imagining things. He stopped eating the meals she packed for him, always with some version of the same excuse, a client lunch, a working breakfast, until she realized it wasn't that he'd stopped eating during the day, it was that he'd stopped wanting to eat what she made specifically. He stopped introducing her at industry events, and when she did attend one with him, she noticed him angling his body slightly away from her whenever certain people approached, the ones with the biggest titles, the ones he was working hardest to impress. A woman named Simone Ashford entered his orbit around this time, a broker from a rival firm known more for her polish than her closing numbers, someone who spoke about property portfolios and market positioning, with the kind of confidence that made rooms lean in, even when the substance underneath was thinner than it looked. Terrence started mentioning her name more often at dinner, always professionally, always with a reason, until the reasons started outnumbering the dinners themselves. There was a housewarming that spring for one of Terrence's biggest clients, the kind of event Renae would have once been asked to help cater, let alone attend as a guest. Instead, she found out about it through a photo posted online. Terrence in a linen blazer she didn't recognize. Simone beside him in a group of agents raising glasses on a rooftop deck overlooking the city. When she asked him about it later, careful to keep her voice even, he told her it had been a last-minute work thing, nothing worth mentioning, the kind of event that wouldn't have been fun for her anyway. She noticed he didn't say she wouldn't have been welcome. He said it wouldn't have been fun, as if the problem was her enjoyment, and not his decision to leave her out of it. She let that distinction sit with her longer than she let most things sit. One Tuesday, Renae drove out to the property he was staging for a walkthrough with investors, a plate of food balanced carefully on the passenger seat, because she knew he'd been on site since early morning without eating. When she arrived, Terrence pulled her aside before she could even set the container down and told her, quietly but firmly, that she should stay in the kitchen area during the walkthrough, out of sight of the investors, because it's a different energy when clients are here. She stood there holding a plate of food she'd made before sunrise, being told to hide in the room she wasn't allowed to be seen leaving from. She left the plate on a folding table near the back door without a word and drove home. When she came back that same property days later to drop off supplies for a small event, she found the plate exactly where she'd left it, untouched, cold, eventually thrown out with the rest of the construction debris. She said nothing to him about it. She had learned by then that saying something rarely changed anything, and that silence, at least, was hers to control. Around this same time, Renae began noticing small inconsistencies in the way Terrence talked about the restaurant space itself, the one she had spent nearly a year and a significant amount of her own savings renovating so he could use it for client meetings and, eventually, his headquarters launch. He had started referring to it in interviews and casual conversation as "my building" and "the space I found," language that quietly erased the fact that Renae had negotiated the lease terms, sourced the contractors, and personally selected every fixture in the room, down to the light bulbs. When a local business journal ran a short profile on his rise, the accompanying photo showed Terrence standing in the middle of the dining room Renae had designed, with a caption crediting him with transforming an overlooked commercial space into a premier business address. Her name did not appear anywhere in the piece. She read it twice, then closed the tab, and told herself that credit didn't matter as much as the relationship did, a lie she was getting better at telling herself with each passing month. If you're still watching up to now, type "still" here in the comment section, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you understand about who really built what. What Renae didn't know, what almost no one on that block knew, was that her grandmother Odessa had never actually lost everything when the city rezoned this street back in the 80s. While most of the black-owned businesses on the block were pushed out or bought below value, Odessa had managed, through a partnership most people never learned about, to hold on to a 35% ownership stake in the commercial building that would eventually house both Mr. Yoon's grocery and, decades later, the restaurant space Renae would spend years designing for a man who would one day stand inside it and tell a room full of strangers she wasn't built for where he was going. Before she passed, Odessa placed that stake into a trust, and she asked one person to hold it. Not a lawyer, not a bank, but the quiet young grocer who had just opened his store next door and who she'd watched work with an honesty she rarely saw in that neighborhood anymore. She gave Mr. Yoon one instruction, and only one. Don't give it to my granddaughter until she's built something with her own hands first, so that no one, not even Renae herself, could ever say the building was what made her, instead of her making the building. For 20 years, Mr. Yoon kept that promise without a single slip, watching Renae grow a folding table into a full catering business, watching her marry, watching her pour everything she had into a man who increasingly looked past her, and never once telling her what she already owned. He watched her hand over her mother's insurance money. He watched her pawn her grandmother's ring. He watched her get quietly erased from the story of a success she had funded, piece by piece, sacrifice by sacrifice. And on the night Terrence stood in that restaurant and told a room full of strangers that Renae wasn't part of where he was going, Mr. Yoon finally understood that the waiting was over. 2 weeks after the divorce filing, Renae received a call asking her to stop by the grocery store after her evening shift, the same way she had 100 times before, except this time Mr. Yoon locked the front door behind her and pulled 2 folding chairs up to the small table in the back where he usually did inventory. He set a thick manila folder in front of her without saying anything at first. "Your grandmother gave me something to hold for you," he finally said. 20 years ago, I promised her I wouldn't give it to you until you didn't need it to prove anything. Renae opened the folder slowly. Inside were deed records, a notarized trust agreement, and her grandmother's handwriting on a letter dated more than 2 decades earlier. She scanned the pages once, then again, her hands slower than her eyes. "This building," she said quietly, "the one Terrence just signed for." Mr. Yoon nodded. "Your grandmother never lost this block the way everyone thought she did," he said. "She kept 35%, quietly, on purpose." Renae stared at the documents for a long moment, and something in her face changed. Not shock exactly, something quieter, something that had been waiting a very long time to surface. "There's one more thing," Mr. Yoon said, sliding a second, thinner document across the table. "The original ownership agreement your grandmother signed. Any lease over 5 years on that property requires sign-off from every owner holding more than 30%. He looked at her steadily. "Terrence just announced a 10-year lease," he said. In front of cameras, Renae looked down at her own name, printed in black and white, on a page that had been waiting 20 years for her to need it. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply closed the folder, sat back in the chair, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to breathe all the way out. "Why now?" she finally asked. "Why not years ago, when I needed help, when I was giving away everything I had and getting nothing back?" Mr. Yoon considered the question carefully before answering. "Because if I had given this to you then, you would have used it to save him," he said. "Your grandmother didn't want you to save anyone with it. She wanted you to finally be seen for what you already were. Renae sat with that for a long time, turning the pages over slowly, reading her grandmother's handwriting again and again, a voice from decades ago that had somehow understood exactly where this road would lead, before Renae had even taken her first step down it. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that exists right before something changes for good. She thought about the ring she'd pawned and never bought back. She thought about the untouched plate left cold on a folding table. She thought about a room full of strangers watching a man tell her she wasn't built for where he was going, while the ground beneath his new headquarters had belonged to her family the entire time. She had a decision in front of her now, one her grandmother had clearly seen coming long before she did. Sign the lease and let him keep everything he'd built on her back. Or stand in that building one more time, in front of everyone who had watched her get erased, and let them watch something else happen instead. She picked up her phone and called the property management office to schedule a meeting for the following week. What happens in that meeting, and what happens when Terrence finds out exactly whose signature his 10-year lease is missing, is coming in part 2. If this story has you hooked so far, let us know in the comments what you think Renae is going to do next. Subscribe to Mind Tales and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2, where everything comes full circle. And if you enjoyed this one, tap like before you go. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it.